It's February 22nd, 1931, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
As Pan Am pilot Byron Rickards landed his Ford tri-motor two-person aeroplane on an airstrip in Arequipa in the mountains of southern Peru on this day in 1931, he was immediately surrounded by an army of revolutionary soldiers who apparently quite politely explained to him that he would henceforth be required to fly as they demanded, thus beginning the first ever recorded plane hijacking.
Oh, I mean, considering what a terrifying thing it must be to be the victim of a hijacking, how awful that my first reaction is one of disappointment that the plane wasn't in midair at the time.
Yes, I know, that didn't happen until much later.
It's a historic moment. Don't do an on-the-ground hijacking. It's disappointing.
I've got one you might like, actually. It's not technically a hijacking for reasons that will become obvious, but the first mid-air attack was earlier than this. It was 1928 when an 18-year-old called Clarence Frechette attacked a pilot called Harry W. Anderson, who he had commissioned to fly him over Michigan. He started attacking him with a hammer for unclear reasons. However, he didn't ever take the controls, and Anderson revived in time miraculously to crash land the plane, and neither of them were killed. So it's not true hijacking. And actually, Frechette, after he got out of prison for this attack, would later be stopped by police with his boss's body in the boot of his car. So I feel like this was probably just a murderer who happened to be in midair rather than a hijacker.
Yes.
So there do need to be kind of political motivations generally for it to count as a hijacking, and this one certainly had those.
Yes, and the particular political motivation that was going on at the time is that Peru was in the midst of this period of turmoil where some areas of the country were being controlled by rebels, others by the government, and planes were regularly being used to drop pro-government propaganda on the rebel-held territories in Peru. But their size, the size of the planes I mean, meant that they had to refuel often, which was what led Rickards to bring his plane down in this rebel-held area at the time. He was refueling.
And just to be clear, in case you missed it, what led him to Peru was doing propaganda for the Peruvian government.
Right.
So there's a revolution going on, or a revolutionary organisation assembling to revolt against the military junta. And this is often portrayed like, still, if you go on the website of Guinness World Records of this being the first hijack, this is portrayed as like, oh, Rickards suddenly found himself being told he was being part of a revolutionary organisation. It's like, yeah, but he was already politically involved because he'd already taken the gig. He was a Pan Am pilot who'd taken some money from Peru to drop leaflets. And all that happened is when he landed, opportunistically, the revolutionary organisation in the area were like, no, mate, you're going to drop our leaflets now. He was doing it anyway.
To be fair, though, if he was a mail pilot, if the mail that was being sent happened to be propaganda posters and the sender said, look, can you deliver it to all over Lima, he was just doing his job as a mail pilot.
And he was relatively heroic in his response, at least. You know, if I were some sort of regular, everyday mail pilot out there dropping propaganda leaflets on behalf of the Peruvian government,
flip on a coin, wouldn't you?
I would flip in 5 seconds flat.
Yes, people with guns, I'll drop your propaganda for you.
I will tell the people whatever you want me to tell them. But Rickards flat out refused, which led to this 10-day standoff, at the end of which the soldiers pretty much... well, at this point, the revolution had been successful, and they said, you're free to go with one condition, which is that you give one of us a lift to Lima.
Well, this is the thing, I think, that's a sort of logical problem with this era of hijacking, is for the pilot in any hijack to take you seriously and take you to the destination you want rather than the one that they want, they have to believe that you really might kill them if you don't. And of course, if you do kill them, you can't fly the plane.
That was actually the discovery of one of the very next hijacks, which took place in September 1932, when a Sikorsky S-38 was seized in Brazil by 3 men who took a 4th as a hostage. And they had no flying experience, but they did manage to take off. And I don't know if either of you have played any flight sims, but... you are lulled into the belief that you are a pilot by takeoff. You're like, oh, this is a piece of cake. You just hit the gas and go. But then as soon as it comes to the landing bit, you're like, oh, wait, yeah, no, I'm really not a pilot. And that's unfortunately what these 3 men discovered, where they crashed and they all died at the end of it.
This incident doesn't seem to have sparked a massive rush of hijackings. There was some in the 40s and 50s. Most of them were people from Central and Eastern Europe trying to flee communist regimes. Some of them were RAF pilots and that kind of thing, in Czechoslovakia and Poland who wanted to come to the West. But they really took off in the 60s. There was an explosion of, well, it's an unfortunate expression. But in the 60s, you had, obviously, commercial aviation was expanding very rapidly. But the other thing was that a lot of these hijackings were taking place between the US and Cuba. Mostly people in the US hijacking flights to go to Cuba, but very occasionally the other way around as well. And this kind of became the hotspot of international hijackings.
It's so weird, isn't it, that there weren't flights from the US to Cuba, and so for a lot of people the option was hijacking, and it was in this sort of neat mid-period between access to flights becoming much more available and before they'd actually introduced the sorts of checks that we are all familiar with these days, where they check you for knives and guns and explosives before you get on a flight.
And you'll never guess who got caught up in this second boom of hijacking. Can I do the big reveal? It must be me.
Yes, you can.
Only pilot Byron Rickards of the USA.
Get out.
30 years after his first hijacking, he then got hijacked again in 1960 when flying for Continental Airlines. The hijackers wanted him to take them to Cuba, but he convinced them that there was nowhere to land, and so he eventually took them to El Paso, where the FBI arrested them. It was an 8.5-hour hijack by a father-son team, which was resolved on the plane apparently, although obviously at the time this was reported patriotically, by an immigration officer who was on board and punched them to the ground and took their guns.
Seems like a sensible way of handling it.
That's another thing I wouldn't do.
But the thing is, it's so hard to get into the mindset. If you look at the way that these hijackings in the 60s and 70s were reported, it's like when you're looking at it from our vantage point, especially for me, 9/11 was pretty much the first plane hijacking I ever heard about. I was 10 when that happened. It's so weird to realise that that was the first incident where the planes were hijacked to be used as suicide bombs. Before then, if you read the coverage in the 60s, it's seen as almost like streakers at a football match. I mean, it's an annoying, silly publicity stunt. It's an inconvenience. And the idea that hijackers with these would be murderers and that they should be sentenced to life in prison. I think it was this 1961 hijacking, the second Rickards hijacking. I think I read that those two perpetrators, the father and son, were the first people to go to prison for hijacking a plane.
It's also astonishing how late all of the countermeasures that have come to be put in place were put in place. That planes were flying for decades before they introduced in the 60s and 70s these things like metal detectors and X-ray machines and explosive detection tools. And really from there they spread around the world. But it was as late as the 70s that most countries had started to introduce these really rudimentary things to stop people bringing weapons onto aeroplanes.
But incredibly, Rickards doesn't seem to hold the title of the most hijacked pilot. Ethiopian Airlines pilot Lula Bate was hijacked 3 times in 4 years. He was hijacked in 92, 95 and 96.
It begins to look like carelessness, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Can we talk about the origins of the word hijack? Any ideas?
That it's you're getting jacked in the and it's up high. I don't know. Yeah, go.
I mean, it's not any more ridiculous than what I found. I mean, I was just curious because I know that it's the OED has it as an early 20th century American term, which I guess is what I would have expected, but doesn't actually explain where it comes from. So I did find an amusing interaction in the Guardian's Notes and Queries about 20 years ago, in which they invite readers to come in with their own sort of folk etymology. One reader said, it came from the Prohibition era, but justified it thusly. Supposedly, a member of one gang would approach the driver of a rival gang's bootlegging truck with a smile and disarming hijack before sticking the muzzle of a gat in the face of the poor unfortunate and relieving him of both truck and its alcoholic cargo. I mean, that is obvious nonsense.
I like it, though.
But more convincingly to me, a journalist as well had said that they remembered this happening. It was the compound word highway jackrolling from motorway incidents in the US that became hijacking. Commandeering a car or intervening on a highway. Someone posited that its origins might be from the French word hijacker, which was used apparently when peasants used to eject aristocrats from their coaches and steal their possessions.
I mean, it's gone. That was like a sandwich of explanations. Only the middle one was decent. They did coin the word skyjacking as well, which seems to have been pretty commonplace in the 70s, which was definitely the golden age of plane hijacking, by the way. That section on Wikipedia, you look and it's like, a few in the 40s, few in the 50s, quite a few now in the 60s. The 70s is just hijacking after hijacking. It's crazy that there were any flights that weren't hijacked when you look at it. But skyjacking doesn't seem to have caught on. I think maybe it's a bit too cute, isn't it?
Well, I don't know. Sounds like a tag on Pornhub.
Hashtag Mile High, hashtag Skyjack.
Tomorrow.
There is actually a Dolly's Tea Room in Roslyn.
Which, to be fair, is quite a modest way of capitalising on the success.
Love the show? Support the show. Patreon.com/retrospectors. Part of the Acast Creator Network.